So when it comes to shutter speed for filmmaking, there seems to be a bit of a misconception because a lot of people try to tell you something like this.
If you're shooting in 24 frames per second, you should have a shutter speed of 48 or 50 if your camera doesn't do 48. Or if you're filming in 60 frames per second, you should have a shutter speed of 120. And so on, always doubling whatever your frame rate is.
But I'm sorry, Maddie, you're missing some points here, and today I want to tell you guys what you really need to know about shutter speed settings for filmmakers. By the way, if you're new to the channel, my name is Tom Streller. I'm a filmmaker, and on this channel I cover everything filmmaking related. So if you're into this, make sure to subscribe to not miss any upcoming videos. I guarantee you won't regret it. So for those of you who don't already know, the shutter speed settings of your camera control the light that hits your sensor in a certain amount of time and therefore control the exposure of your shot. And this goes for photo and video. The lower your shutter speed is, the longer your sensor is open and the more light will come in, making your shot brighter. On the other hand, when your shutter speed is higher, less light will come in, therefore making your shot darker, while also decreasing the amount of motion blur in your shot. Because that is the second factor the shutter speed controls, motion blur. And the lower your shutter speed is, the more motion blur you will have in your shot. In videography, motion blur is supposed to make your shot look cinematic, and therefore you often want to keep your shutter speed lower. And if you're now wondering, but Tom, how am I supposed to expose my sunny shot correctly with a low shutter speed? Don't panic, because there's something called ND filters, which is essentially like sunglasses for your camera. And like probably everybody owns a pair of sunglasses for the sunny days, every filmmaker should have some ND filters in their camera bag. And I actually already made a video about that, which you can watch up here. There's also a basic rule for getting your shutter speed right when shooting videos, the 180-degree rule. And this rule says that you're supposed to keep your shutter speed around double your frame rate to get a natural motion blur. And here's what actually bothers me. A lot of filmmakers, especially here on YouTube, make it seem as if this rule was set in stone. And if you're not doing it this way, you're doing it wrong. But there are a few scenarios when doing it wrong is actually right. Or at least not totally wrong. First and foremost, when shooting slow motion. And here's some quick slow motion B-roll for you, which has absolutely nothing to do with this topic, but it looks great, so I hope you enjoy it. So when it comes to slow motion, there's actually so little movement going on that you wouldn't notice any motion blur even if you had your shutter speed set correctly. So my advice is, if you're shooting your super slow motion B-roll, stop fiddling around with ND filters and just dial in the exposure with your shutter speed. It's much quicker and easier, and nobody will see a difference, honestly. Over the last year I shot probably all my slow motion without an ND filter and just cranked up the shutter speed to get the exposure right. And I can tell you, it works perfectly fine. Back when I started with filmmaking, of course, I always tried to get my shutter speed right. I always had a variable ND filter screwed on top of my lens, but after a while I felt like in some scenarios this was actually holding me back. Especially if you're doing some run and gun shooting and things are moving really fast. Fiddling around with ND filters can get pretty annoying. So I started to shoot without an ND filter in several scenarios, and I realized pretty soon that for some shots it actually doesn't make any difference at all. Another YouTube filmmaker named Parker Warbeck got asked on one of his videos why he didn't use ND filters for a wedding shoot and just cranked up the shutter speed. And he got some pretty good reasons for that. First of all, like I already stated, for run and gun shooting it's sometimes just easier and faster to get the exposure right with the shutter speed. And for some jobs, fast and easy is just more important than getting motion blur. And what I found really interesting is that if you shoot in 4K, you could actually export some really sharp still images from the video, which would be totally useless if you had a lot of motion blur going on. But don't get me wrong here, I'm not saying that motion blur and shutter speed don't matter at all. There are certain situations where a correct shutter speed is required. Like when the movement or the action is in the main focus of your video, you should definitely get your shutter speed right. If you want your shot to look realistic and you want that cinematic look, definitely set your shutter speed according to the 180-degree rule. Because you also should keep in mind that bumps and shakes appear more visible in your videos if you shoot with a high shutter speed, whereas a certain amount of motion blur just makes them appear not as obvious. But if you want to go for a more rough and gritty look, you can actually set your shutter speed pretty high to make everything look more intense, as they do in a lot of Hollywood action movies. I did this when shooting my short video in Madeira, where I wanted everything to look a little less soft, so I cranked up the shutter speed a bit to make the steps and everything look a bit sharper and rougher, which added a nice visual aspect to the entire look. So that is actually all I wanted to say, since I kind of had this on my chest for quite a while now. Because I feel like a lot of people take things they hear in a YouTube tutorial for granted and not think about it twice. Like if some YouTuber tells them to always have their shutter speed right, they wouldn't dare to have it incorrect just once. But there are exceptions for everything, so you should take all you learn on the internet with a grain of salt. Even this video. Nevertheless, I hope you guys found this video helpful, and make sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel to see more filmmaking related videos like this one, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.